Hi, Naomi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Uh, Yes.
Okay, great. So we're going to be continuing our conversation we were having about the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes.
Okay, I hope you remember more than I do. Do you remember? You remember some of it?
A nice few bunch. It was a good discussion. So,
It was fun. Yeah, I
uh,
enjoyed. That's why
yeah,
I wanted to do part two
yeah,
because I thought it was
me too. Yeah,
interesting.
I
And
was really into it at the end. Yeah. Um,
okay, so we talked a little bit about
mhm.
my personal kind of initial almost fear of even looking into the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then kind of
Right.
how I overcame that fear, what happened, my story of how I heard
Mhm.
an amazing lecture by
Mhm.
Rachel Elior that
Mhm.
captured my imagination and intrigued me. And that's why I started paying much more attention to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Mhm. Yes. Um,
And we started talking about who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls.
right. Right.
What did do you remember who did I say wrote it?
Well, if I remember correctly, it was sort of a point of contention because the way the Dead Scrolls were discovered, and it was a very sort of story about. I think there was a boy playing in this area in Jerusalem, and it was a very how it was discovered was very interesting in general. So there's a lot of questions, discussions about archaeologists and academics studying about the different Jewish communities or different off Jewish communities at that in that era of the time, and that are contention that could have written. I believe we were discussing, right?
Yeah. We talked about a little bit about the contemporary kind of finding it. It was found by some
Right,
Bedouins,
right.
and that it was initially um, there was a certain like a priest or somebody who was initially tasked with trying to decipher it, and then
Mm-hmm.
the first till the through the 80s it was really off limits. Until the 80s, it was off limits to Jewish scholars. And then in the 80s and then more in the 90s, it was more accessible to all scholars, including Jewish scholars, because before that it was in the hands of the Jordanians. And eventually, after the 67 war and political pressure, it was opened up for all scholars, including Jewish scholars. And that may have allowed for a new way of seeing who the authors may have been. The two leading kind of uh, um, answers, just to summarize, is that it's either the Essenes with an
Mm-hmm.
E, or and that was the prevailing opinion. In fact, until today, many scholars will just keep reciting almost like parrots. The prevailing opinion is that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by the Essenes.
Mm-hmm.
However, the other opinion, which is a serious, I think is a serious opinion, um, is suggesting that it was in fact the B'nai Tzadok, the Tzadokites, that
Mm-hmm.
in fact it was their library, and they either wrote it or transported it from an existing library to the Qumran, to the what we call the caves of the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scroll community.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a quick recap. And let's get
Mm-hmm.
into more details of this
Yeah.
very interesting
Um,
story.
yes. So with that context of the sort of debated points of who could have been the possible writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'm I'm curious, do you have an opinion of, what you think is more likely the case of, some of the opinions that have been put out there?
Yeah, my opinion is that I believe that the text itself points to the Bnei Tzadok. Some people refer to the Bnei Tzadok as also the Sadducees. I don't want to use that word now. I specifically want to refer to them specifically as the children of Tzadok, the descendants of Tzadok. They were a priestly class. They were in a state of exile from the temple. And there's a little bit of the backstory. And this is based on the research of Rachel Elior. And I find it very compelling. I'll also tell you why not everybody agrees with her, but let's first focus on why she believes that it's the Bnei Tzadok and not the Essenes. When you look at a library, you look for a few things. You look for commonalities. You look for things that everyone might have. And then you look for particularities. You look for specific things that would identify who the specific owner of the library is. So, for example, if you walk into a library and it has an encyclopedia, that's not so revealing about the nature. A lot of people have encyclopedias, a dictionary, a book on the Guinness Book of World Record. These are standard books. You start seeing, okay, they like history. They like 17th century French legal history. Then you say, okay, maybe the person was a historian. And maybe they were an expert. You start developing a sense of who that person is when you get into the specific works that they have. So if you look at the library, this is what Rachel Elior's point is she really points out that you have these 5 categories, 5 bookshelves, if you would, call it that. And the first 2 bookshelves are basically, well, the first bookshelf is a bookshelf you would find in anybody's library living at that time who was Jewish in Palestine, Israel. Okay? Why? Because it's the Bible. It's the work of the prophets. Some minor variations, but it's basically, that's what it is. The scroll that was the biggest, meaning it has a complete scroll, because a lot of the scrolls are partial scrolls or just fragments, it's called the Great Isaiah Scroll. There's a whole story about that. And then you work your way down into like literature that's similar to the Bible, like almost an interpretation of the Bible. And then that would be the second category. The third is the mystical literature. The fourth is a polemic library. And then the fifth is very sectarian, very clear about the leanings of that group. So as you go further away from the general library, you get more specific, like who are these people? Why do they have this library? What are they all about? And in that library, it basically tells a story about a displaced people who thought of themselves as the rightful heir of the temple in Jerusalem, which they revered in theory. They believed that that was a sacred place. Even in their biblical literature, they mention in their own style of biblical literature, they mention Jerusalem more than the regular Bible does. So Jerusalem is very central, and the temple is very central. But what happened from a historic perspective, if we believe this, is that they were the Kohanim, they were the high priests in the Beit HaMikdash before the Greeks took over. We all know about the famous story of Hanukkah. We heard of Antiochus, the wicked king. I sang that with you as a child. Antiochus, the wicked king. He made the Jews do a terrible thing.
Yeah.
Right. And he made us back. And actually, that's true. He basically took over the temple and he made it a place of worship for the Greek gods and for himself.
Mm-hmm.
So the Greek kings usurped the Kohanim Gedolim. And there was a period in history from about 175 BCE that Antiochus imposed his order on the temple. And that would be the time that the Bnei Tzadok would have been displaced. Now you would think, okay, well then there was a Jewish hero arose named Matisyahu, the Maccabee, and his sons, and they rose against the Greeks, and they won the battle, and everybody knows the story because it's what's the name of the story when they won? What holiday do we celebrate?
Hanukkah.
Exactly. So what happened then? Who became the Kohanim Gedolim then? Who became the high priests? It wasn't the Bnei Tzadok.
Right.
The original Tzadok was a Kohen Gadol, the high priest in the time period of the early temple of King Solomon. But they were displaced from the temple, and they were replaced first by the Kohanim that worked for the Greeks, like Jason. And then when Matisyahu and his sons won, they were replaced by the Hashmonaim. They became the high priests. So they had no place. This family, or it's a clan, not really a family, it's a clan that had identification with the descendants of Tzadok, with positions of power within the temple, were displaced, and they went into some form of exile. And according to Rachel Elior, they had access to many of the books in the area of the temple. Many of the manuscripts they were able to take with them because they had earlier had positions of power. So they had access to them. So they could have taken from existing libraries in Jerusalem and brought them to wherever they brought them, ultimately ending up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Rachel Elior doesn't believe that all of those works were written by scribes because it's written over a period of 250 years. It's not all written in that area. So some of it was written before and brought there. Now that was a source of contention. Some people would like to think originally that it was a scribal community and all of the things written there were written by people there. That was an error, I think an error that the earlier academics wanted to believe that this was like a monastery where celibate people, who they believed to be, the Essenes were known to be celibate, sat in a monastic lifestyle because it's a very arid, hot place. It's like living in Arizona and Phoenix, hotter than Phoenix there. And they must have had this solitary lifestyle, this monastic lifestyle, and they wrote. And that's what they did. But if Rachel Elior is correct, they didn't live there as a community that whole time as scribes. They lived in Jerusalem earlier.
So it was sort of a moving document that they took with them over generations as they left the temple.
Exactly.
To that.
In over time, it didn't have to happen all in one shot. It could have been successive generations. One could have pulled out a little earlier from Jerusalem, one a little later, and they brought with them those manuscripts.
Yes. So it sounds to me that Rachel Elior makes a very compelling case, and that the contention and the greater debate between her case is I guess, according to the text, it's more likely that it's tied to the people of Bnei Tzedek, that it's more likely the case that, in her opinion, that that looking of the circumstantial evidence or the greater context of their libraries and the text of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they took it along with them, and it's more tied to them as a people and their sort of worldview, in contention with what others say, those who would disagree with her, that want to tie it more to the region, and then the lifestyle of the Essenes. So I can definitely sense, I like the argument that you seem to have summarized well of hers, but it just in terms of having, as much context as possible, could you sort of elaborate a little bit on sort of the other case, sort of the disagreements that may be with her case, for her opinion?
So the other side of the argument is the Essenes. Let's talk about why it was almost like it's got to be the Essenes. Why that was the initial before. Look, they didn't have time to go through all of these fragments and read them right away. But what they did know is that there were 3 historians of antiquity that had already talked about the Essenes. One of them was, I'm trying to get in order, Philo, Pliny, and Josephus, in that order. So they first Philo talks about them. He says there's 4,000, they're spread around, they're very virtuous. He says wonderful things about them. Pliny says they've been around forever, and he identifies them with the West Coast on the seashore. And he says they've been around for thousands of generations. They're celibate. He says wonderful things about them. They were around during the times of Moses. So he's not saying a historical fact. He's just saying they've been around for a while. At least they're claiming to have been around for a while. Now, Josephus says things about them. Doesn't always. He's not always. He says things about them. He says actually some nice things, as opposed to, let's say, when he talks about the Sadducees, he doesn't say as nice things, and he numbers them as about 4,000 people. He says they're scattered about.
And the Sadducees is the word for B'nai Tzedek. Is that
no? Essenes. We're talking about Essenes.
But when you're saying when he was discussing the Sadducees, just to clarify.
When he did say not nice things about the Sadducees, is that the same as the B'nai Tzedek? Not necessarily. I'm going to keep them apart. They may or may not be. I believe they're a subset that sometimes people say Tzedukim or Sadducees, and they include them, but I don't think that when the rabbis talk about the Tzedukim, they don't necessarily mean the B'nai Tzedek. They use the word Tzedukim very loosely. They probably have a bunch of different groups that they're referring to in that same word.
When he's referring to Sadducees.
Yeah, but let's get back to the scenes. I just brought them up. Let's focus on the scenes for now. We'll get back to Sadducees later. Okay. I just brought them up as a reference.
The contrast of how he discussed them and
exactly.
Exactly.
Okay. Josephus is the one. I mean, everything we have, the categories of what we call the so-called sectarianism, that's all Josephus. Josephus is the guy who puts it into what we would call today the Reformed Conservative Orthodox, or what the Christians would say Catholic Protestant. Like he's the one who gives it popular terms.
Right, the sects of Judaism at that time. That's what Jesus is. Okay. And
it's time for a reevaluation of a little bit of our kind of taking everything Josephus says at face value.
Right.
And a lot of people are examining, maybe there's more groups or there's more subgroups and he's not mentioning them for some reason. And there are a lot of other groups.
Mm-hmm.
So let's for a moment say there is a subgroup called the B'nai Tzedek. And you might even want to say that there's 2 B'nai Tzedeks. One of the B'nai Tzedek was part of the Sadducees, and another part of the B'nai Tzedek were not part of the Sadducees. And that's what, and and the part of the B'nai Tzedek that were part of the Sadducees still had some pull at some point in the temple, even after the Chashmonaim.
Mm-hmm.
They might have had made some accommodations to working with the rabbis and still argued with them, with the Pharisees about certain things, but agreed on others. And then there were the more intense B'nai Tzedek who could not live in Jerusalem anymore.
Mm-hmm. And is that the one that, just to tie it back in, that makes the distinction that is the second opinion of who could have possibly written the Dead Sea Scrolls is the one that is not part of the Sadducees?
Well, the second opinion might be, the second opinion, I'm going to assume, doesn't want to use the word B'nai Tzedek.
Okay, so they would say the one that is included in they say the Sadducees.
No Sadducees, no Essenes. Let's leave it. Let's stop using
No, I
the word
don't mean
Sadducees.
I just mean the one you were talking about right before, the B'nai Tzedek. When you were
let's
discussing her
say
case.
either Essenes or B'nai Tzedek for now. Okay.
Okay. And then
so if it's the Essenes, then they left no writing, right? And initially the writing at the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, we didn't know who the authors were. So it was like a perfect shidduch. Here you have books without an author, and here you have people without a book. Let's put them together and say, these people who we know were located in that area, that general area, let's put them together, and ta-da, it's the Essenes.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, when you read those books, it doesn't talk about the Essenes.
Mm-hmm.
There are some people who have a stretch that say there's a verse that sounds like a scene in it. It's a very big stretch.
Mm-hmm.
But it's what we know about the Essenes. That's not what the books describe. Not even the sectarian, not even the specific parts of the library that are very specific. So it's like saying that I don't know if this library belongs to a mathematician or a historian, but I know a historian who once lived here, and I know this is a library, and I don't know whose it is, so it must be a historian.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I look at the books, they're math books. Why would I keep saying it's a historian?
Right.
It's a mathematician.
Right.
So they basically jumped the gun. Before they really analyzed all the text very carefully, they decided already who wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
Without really being open to changing their mind. Because a lot of people, that's the opinion. And it fit in with some historical, geographical location that none other than Pliny mentioned. So it's got to be that. But Pliny wasn't talking about exactly this specific location at that specific time. We people move around. There's other people there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like saying I'm set on it being a historian's library because I know a historian lived in the neighborhood.
Right. Because they know the Essenes live there. They very much tie the people who make that argument to the region. Exactly. And that seems to be the flaw in it, because it doesn't look in the greater context of the actual text of the Dead Sea Scrolls and putting it into the other commonalities of the different sects of who is more likely to have written and engaged in that type of text and discourse. Right. So just to tie it all in, why is this issue so important, you think, to really, discuss in the debate of this issue of who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? Like, why is it important that we talk about it and learn about it as a core of how that affects the way that it's looking at as a historical text, and also the history of just that era and that region, and which is a very influential place and time of history. Why is this question in particular so important, you think?
Well, I think there's two answers to that. One is just the amount of curiosity and interest. There hasn't really been texts from that period. Mm-hmm. It's hard to preserve things. It was the Dead Sea scroll. It was the air and that was able to preserve it there for so long. So it's just so rare that it's a very interesting time. Obviously, the Christian world was enamored with the potential of finding some reference to Jesus, and they were very interested in that. And they never really found a reference, but they found things that still resonated with them, even if it wasn't exactly what they were hoping to find. But more than that, the reason why I think it's important to talk about it now and leave the debate open, instead of, a lot of people are saying the consensus is it's the Essenes, is that I've noticed that people, when they now write about the Essenes, they take for granted that the Essenes wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and based on what the Dead Sea Scrolls say, the sectarian parts of it, they're now projecting that back onto the Essenes. So all the stuff that it says in the Essenes are basically now being that it says in the Dead Sea Scrolls are now being said. The Essenes were basically a priestly class. They basically had a calendar that was a solar calendar. They basically used to, they were in the temple. They were exiled. So it's like, no, that's not the Essenes. We only know that because those are the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can't just use the wrong name and then change the history of that name to fit in. It doesn't work like that. So the history is being rewritten as we speak. And it's just like they should say. Some people say this is it's Essenes. It's I don't care that there's a consensus. If a lot of people really are saying there's a consensus and we don't know, because they're afraid to say that they think against what somebody 50 years ago said.
To change
They're
what
not being open. They're being very, what we would call orthodox. They're stuck in that.
But that's not common in academia, isn't it? That they're supposed to, as like in sciences and academia, as new things come out, you change the consensus or you update of like, oh, there's a new discovery, you know. And especially as people like Marcella Lior, and I hope she's not the only one who have, you know, done the research and brought in the other opinions to, you know, there's other evidence. It's not taking
it's becoming an orthodoxy too soon. You want to make something an orthodoxy, that's fine. Just do your research. I don't really believe enough consensus is there to just say this is the Essenes. Yeah, we've got the consensus of the Essenes. Let's rewrite history like that. I believe that's too early, and it would be a big mistake. I'm not conclusively saying it's for sure the B'nai Tzadok. I just think it points in that direction enough that even the scholars who think it's the Essenes should wait while
and the issue is
conducted.
If you do have, if that is like one's case, it should be, okay, what is it about the Essenes that can make it the case that could draw from it the context that possibly the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by the Essenes, as opposed to now we're changing history, like you said, rewriting of like there's a misinterpretation about the history of the Essenes and who they were, and sort of I would think a disrespect because people are making conclusions based on the Dead Sea Scrolls about the Essenes that could be incorrect, just based on the assumption that they wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. So now the Dead Sea Scrolls affects how the Essenes are seen through historically. So is that right? That sounds like that's really the main issue with it.
That's the main issue, because then it's going to be harder to for anyone to make an argument. You're going to go into a college and try to say it's not the Essenes because these texts point to the B'nai Tzadok, and people will say, no, the texts point to the Essenes because the Essenes have all of those qualities. How do we know that?
They only assume that those are the qualities of the Essenes based on the assumption that what the Dead Sea Scrolls say, based that they wrote it. It's like a cycle fallacy almost.
So it's really a mistake to declare this decided. And I think I'm not academic. Here's the interesting thing. I'm not a scholar of that period in history. I I don't know if I would call myself a scholar, but if somebody else called me a scholar, it would not be of that period of history. It would be of the Talmud, it would be of Kabbalah, it would be of Hasidus, not of that period. But even as just a learned layperson with a strong background in rabbinic literature, I still have a strong sense that people are, I don't want to call being misled, but they're very tied into this way of seeing things, and they should re-examine their positions before writing history, so to speak.
Right, right. Because you're not saying, oh, they're wrong, this is the answer. You're saying it's wrong to just to stay so much rigid in the consensus because it closes people off to studying it more, and you should keep it more open-ended and have more study of
I wouldn't be a fool enough to say that they're wrong,
right.
because I mean, these people have spent years of their life, and I have not. But I would say that it's something that needs to be considered before everyone just says that debate has been settled. You know?
Right. It's just, so yeah, just keep the debate open.
Keep it open. Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time to have this great discussion about this big debate in some people's lives. You know,
it's fascinating stuff. Yeah. But all of this stuff, it's always very relevant with us. So I think it's good to go into religion and go into history and how it supports it and keep, like you said, keep these sort of debates alive and discussions alive. And it's all very interesting. So thank you.
Definitely interesting, and it was a very fascinating moment in history. And when you study the Talmud, they were very well aware that there were many people there were different groups that the deeper you study the Talmud, the more you understand the competition of opinions, of groups. And the rabbis were responding to all of these different groups. It could have been people who were influenced by Greek philosophy. It could be people who believed that a past powerful tribe of Kohanim really should be in charge, who had a different calendar, who celebrated the holidays on a different day. We find references to these things in the Talmud, to the Sikaria, to the people who were brutal, to the early Christians. All of these people were operating at that point, and there's no winners or losers here, you know, but it's all part of our history. And some of these groups are still very active, and others are like the B'nai Tzadok, just something we read about, or the Essenes. We're going to discuss and debate who they were exactly, but it's a historical discussion. It's not a current topic of people who are actually here today.
Discussion is so important because it is the roots of, you know, what is so mainstream today, and you know, debates about, you know, Christianity and Judaism. It's all from that era, and like early centuries, first century Judaism in Jerusalem was a very, you know, it's sort of the culture sort of exploded out, especially Greek, you know, the Greeks and Cyrus, all that.
The intersectionality of cultures and religion.
And it all does sort of, and it's sort of, I wouldn't say like a root, because that makes it sound too, like, you know, granular and small, but like if you think of more like well, maybe that's, you know, like a sprawling, like all of it together, you know, you think of those like graphs and stuff, two sources from that time and all those complex things is like, you know, what Christianity of today and Bible and the debates between that and Judaism is, you know, sort of from that region and the culture and the era. So that's why it's important, even though it's to study those ancient sects, I think, that, or even if they're not as widely known or practiced today, that they really, you can see so many sources there for what is become a larger granulated thing in like Judaism and Christianity today.
The rabbis were in a debate and conversation with them. They agreed on many things. They disagreed on other things, and that's part of the. And you find texts in the Mishnah having arguments with them, in the Talmud, having arguments with them. And likewise, the Qumran has a text that says, this is where we don't agree with these, here's where they see the law differently than us. And it lists a number of things, like 20 something things, in which we beg to differ. So we both have texts that say what the other side allegedly says and what our opinion is.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, yeah, that's
you learn about yourself from the people you argue with.
Yes, that's what debate in general is so important and so fascinating. And I guess this is a great way to leave off, because it leads to other interesting things, bringing up the Mishnah and the Talmud that shows that's not just, this super like halacha and debate, is stuff that you can also, you study that part, and also with the context of the history of it, that really brings it alive.
Yes,
So
maybe we'll do that as another one, understanding the history through the Talmud.
Yes, that could be very.
Even though it's not a history book per se, but there's some parts of it that, with history and with the Talmud, it's like a detective work that we can try to figure out a little bit. So
it's debates, like you said, it brings up actual dialogues and dialects of that time that sort of put you there and give you that.
okay, good. Well, thank you, Naomi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll do this again.
Yes.
Okay, bye.